When we hear the name Antony the Great, a majestic image instantly comes to mind, a wise elder, a hermit whose gaze transcends time, the father of monasticism, a symbol of unyielding will and inner freedom. He embodies the triumph of spirit over matter, a man who ventured into the silent desert and found an entire cosmos within himself. He's known as one of the architects of the inner life, whose teachings and examples shaped the very idea of the spiritual path. However, imagine a man whose youth was far from such holiness. Young Antony, heir to an immense fortune, was, by some accounts, more than just a pragmatic businessman. His early years may have been marked by the very ruthlessness often associated with accumulating wealth. Perhaps he unhesitatingly used his influence to achieve personal goals, not always considering the consequences for others, displaying the cold unscrupulousness that allows one to succeed in the world, but deprives the soul of light. How did this man, immersed in worldly calculations and perhaps lacking empathy, manage to transition from a hard-nosed pragmatist to a spiritual beacon? What caused such a radical, almost inconceivable personal transformation? This is not merely the story of one individual, it is a drama of transfiguration that profoundly moves the soul. To understand the origins of this metamorphosis, we must look into the past, trace the footsteps of his youth, and witness the pivotal moment when the worldly empire within his soul crumbled, giving way to the pursuit of true freedom. We will see how the desert, seemingly a place of oblivion, became a laboratory of the spirit for him in solitude, a path to absolute self-knowledge. The world in which young Antony grew up was not just an arena for life. It was a crucible where destinies were forged, and often souls were broken. The Roman Empire, extending its influence over Egypt, created a complex system where wealth and influence were the sole currencies. It was an era of fierce struggle for resources, where a silent but relentless war was waged for every patch of fertile land, every trade route. Young Antony, heir to a formidable fortune, was no exception to these rules. On the contrary, he became their living embodiment, his sharp mind, honed not for the pursuit of truth but for the multiplication of wealth, quickly mastered the unwritten rules of this game. He was no starry-eyed dreamer. He was a predator whose eyes saw every opportunity, every misstep of a competitor. Where others saw only market chaos or legal loopholes, Antony saw a path to expansion. He could ruthlessly bypass competitors, exploiting every ambiguity in land laws, every debt default. His fortune grew not only from grain and livestock, but also through the skillful use of promissory notes in land disputes, where his influence and tenacity invariably led to an outcome favorable to him. For him, there was no sacred cow in business, only assets to acquire and obstacles to remove. This was a world forged in the fires not only of external wars, but also constant internal strife, where backroom intrigues and betrayals decided the fates of entire lineages. Loyalty here was a commodity, and betrayal was just another tool in the strongman's arsenal. Honor, in the conventional sense, was seen not as a virtue, but rather an impediment to true, tangible power. In this ruthless matrix, only those who could be maximally effective survived, those who weren't afraid to get their hands dirty and who didn't let emotions cloud their judgment. Even his personal life, seemingly a deeply intimate sphere, was a calculated political instrument for strengthening influence. Family ties, marriages of convenience, strategic partnerships built on mutual benefit rather than feelings. Every step was meticulously planned. His home was not just a dwelling, but the headquarters of his growing empire, where every acquaintance, every guest, was evaluated in terms of potential gain. He was building not just a business, but a whole fortress of connections, debts, and obligations, designed to protect and multiply his holdings. Such was young Antony, pragmatic, calculating, and supremely effective within the confines of his time. He built his external empire, unaware that one day this meticulously constructed edifice would prove to be merely a sandcastle, one he himself would be ready to demolish in search of something immeasurably greater. But even the most impregnable fortress built on sand eventually begins to crumble. Young Antony may not have immediately realized that his meticulously constructed external empire, based on cold calculations and power, was doomed. The more he accumulated, the clearer, presumably, became the understanding. Power based on fear and gain could not generate true loyalty. His subjects, be they debtors, partners, or even family members, were more temporary allies than devoted comrades. This structure, stitched together haphazardly from mercantile interests, proved fragile, constantly demanding new efforts to maintain equilibrium. He saw how wealth bred not peace but ceaseless anxiety, how every victory brought new enemies, and every seized asset an even greater craving. This was a crisis not only personal but systemic. His methods, so effective in accumulation, offered no answers to the question of how to cement disparate tribes into a cohesive whole, how to create something enduring that would not fall apart at the slightest breath of change. In search of this new, unshakable foundation, Antony likely turned his gaze beyond the familiar world of deals and intrigues. He was a man accustomed to seeking solutions, and now he faced a task far grander than any business project. He observed various beliefs, as if evaluating potential investments. Paganism, with its multitude of gods, often as capricious and earthly as humans themselves, most likely did not offer the transcendent clarity, the unified moral compass that could unite and inspire. It was merely a mirror of the chaos he may have already grown weary of. Other philosophical schools, while offering interesting ideas, seemed too abstract, unable to offer a practical path for living in a world torn by contradictions. And then, one day, when his soul was likely already ready for change, something happened that forever altered his view of the world. Perhaps it wasn't a single flash, but a series of insights. However, legend, or rather the profound symbolism of his choice, points to a fateful moment. It is said that one day, passing by a Christian church, Antony accidentally overheard the words of the gospel spoken during a service. It was more than just a reading. It was something that pierced him to the very core. He, accustomed to cold calculation and pragmatic gain, was struck by the atmosphere of a community united not by force or money, but by an invisible yet palpable thread of love and self-sacrifice. He saw people who, despite their poverty and outward humility, possessed an inner freedom and peace inaccessible to his wealth. It was then, in those simple words about selling everything and following Christ, that he perhaps saw not a renunciation of life, but the attainment of genuine, unshakable strength. It was not just a religious revelation, but a revelation of a new principle of existence, a new way to build an empire, not external, but internal, founded on spirit, not on matter. And then, overwhelmed by this revelation, Antony acted with the same resolve he once used to close the most profitable deals. For him, this was not merely the fulfillment of a biblical commandment, but an immediate, almost instinctive liquidation of all his old life's assets. He did not hesitate, did not bargain with his conscience as he had once bargained with competitors. He simply took action and sold everything, his vast land holdings, which fed hundreds of families and ensured his comfortable existence. He sold to peasants, not demanding full value, but rather freeing them from debt, bondage. The gold and silver accumulated over generations he distributed to the poor, keeping nothing for himself except a small plot of land for his sister. This act was not simply charity, it was a public execution of his former self, a defiant overthrow of the idol of wealth he had served his entire life. Imagine the shock of those around him. For people of that time, accustomed to the powerful only multiplying their riches, such an act was akin to madness. He didn't just renounce his inheritance, he devalued it, rendered it worthless in the eyes of the world, demonstrating that true value lay beyond the material. This was not an act of despair, but a cold, calculated move made from a new level of consciousness. Antony understood that for many, his actions would be a painful shock therapy, shattering their accustomed worldview. His reputation, built on a predatory ability to acquire, was now nullified by this paradoxical renunciation of everything. He deliberately destroyed his external credit rating to begin building an invisible yet far more stable inner fortress. And this step was merely the first in a chain of total self-renunciation. He departed from the familiar world where every step was calculated, where he was surrounded by servants and flatterers. He moved into the desert not as a fugitive from problems, but as an explorer seeking new territory for his soul. If before he built a business empire, expanding holdings and subjugating resources, now he embarked on building something entirely different. His temples became rock caves, his laws, strict rules of asceticism and self-discipline, Every day in the desert was a new brick in this unseen edifice. He didn't just seek solitude, he conducted an experiment on himself, testing the limits of human will, purifying his consciousness from centuries-old layers of passions and attachments. This former financial strategist, who once masterfully managed flows of goods and money, now learned to manage the currents of his thoughts and emotions. The desert, with its harsh silence and scarcity, became his ideal laboratory. Here there were no distractions, no temptations from the outside world, not even a shadow of his former influence, only he and his inner cosmos. And in this seemingly empty space, he began to discover inexhaustible resources of the spirit of which he had previously been unaware. He learned to see true value not in what could be acquired, but in what could be released. This was an unprecedented investment in himself, in his soul, promising dividends immeasurable by any earthly standards. And it was there, in absolute solitude, that he began to build something far more magnificent than any external empire. He built himself. In this absolute emptiness, where worldly temptations fell silent, Antony discovered something far more valuable than all his earthly assets. He found an entire inner cosmos. The story of Antony the Great is not just a legend of a holy hermit. It serves as powerful, irrefutable proof that even the most hard-nosed and calculating pragmatist is capable of the greatest, almost inconceivable personal transformation. He didn't just break his competitors or bankrupt opponents. At the peak of his worldly power, he found the strength within himself to break himself, to dismantle a meticulously constructed external empire in order to build something entirely new. He replaced the principle of external conquest with the principle of internal liberation, the principle of multiplying material possessions with the multiplication of spiritual treasures, the principle of power over others with absolute control over his own self. It was an act not of despair, but of strategic genius, redirected from the external world to the internal. His retreat into the wild desert was not merely an escape or a search for solitude. It became the act of laying an unshakable foundation for an entire civilizational movement, monasticism, which for centuries to come would serve as a beacon of spiritual quest and self-improvement. He didn't just renounce personal wealth, distributing his vast fortune to the poor. He radically reevaluated the very concept of success and value, showing the world that true strength and genuine prosperity are rooted not in accumulation, but in letting go, not in possession, but in transformation. He didn't just become an ascetic. He became the architect of a new way of being, where inner discipline and self-restraint became tools for achieving unprecedented freedom and profound peace. It was in this inner work, in this unprecedented experiment on himself, that Antony revealed a universal lesson to the world. True strength lies not in the ability to destroy or subjugate, but in the courage to create, starting with oneself. He showed that the grandest empire is not one that conquers lands, but one that conquers and transforms the soul. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the history of Antony the Great. His journey is a powerful reminder of the boundless potential of the human spirit. If this unique transformation has inspired you, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories about people who changed themselves and the world. And of course, share in the comments. What about Antony's story resonated with you the most?